All right, welcome to section 9.8, everyone, where we're going to look at which analysis should you conduct. This one is pretty much a summary of everything that you've looked at in chapter 7 through 9. So we're going to basically build kind of like an infographic that's outlined in your textbook. It's almost like a decision tree. So here you're not actually going to conduct hypothesis tests or confidence intervals. You're just going to decide, are you doing a confidence interval or a hypothesis test, and which type? So let's go ahead and dive in. So in your guided notes, you'll have 4 columns, and each column has a question up on top. The first question that you should ask yourself is, does the problem deal with the mean, or in other words, quantitative data, or a proportion, qualitative data? So I'm just going to note that here. So I'm either working with quantitative or qualitative. From here, once you've made that decision, you need to ask yourself, all right, am I working with 1 or 2 samples? So again, we'll say 1 sample or 2 samples. And we'll note that for both our quantitative group and our qualitative group. So we should have arrows coming off of this to help us figure out that decision tree. The next situation is, if you have 2 samples, then you need to determine if the samples are independent or dependent. So in our case here, for 2 samples, we need to ask ourselves independent or dependent. Likewise, independent and dependent. And then we'll draw those arrows coming off of the 2 samples. Remember that we only asked this question in our assumptions when we were working with 2 samples in sections 9.2 and 9.3. So now, we're going to basically just go through each one, and I'm going to try to do this as carefully and cleanly as possible. So if we are working with a quantitative, and there is 1 sample, then we would decide to do a t-test or a t-interval. Okay. So if you have quantitative data and you have 2 samples that are independent, then we are going to do a 2-sample t-test or a 2-sample confidence interval. I'm just going to abbreviate confidence interval to be CI. All right, so again, we would need to ask ourselves, does the situation involve us doing a hypothesis test or a confidence interval? So for the next one, if it's quantitative, we have 2 samples, but it's dependent this time, then we would opt to do a paired t-test for a hypothesis test, or we're going to do a paired t-interval for our confidence interval. Moving right along. So we've covered all the quantitative options. And I should also mention here, everyone, for your 1 sample, we did have some situations where if we knew our population standard deviation, we would use a z-test or a z-interval. So you can add that note in there. In this infographic, they're assuming that you do not know the population standard deviation. And remember that when you do not know the population standard deviation, when you're checking your assumptions, so if you only know S and not sigma, then we're going to use a t-test or a t-interval. So let's move into our qualitative work. So if we have qualitative data and we have one sample, then we are going to go ahead and conduct a one prop z-test or a one prop z-interval. If instead we have qualitative data, we have two samples, and they are independent of each other, we are going to go ahead and use a two prop z-test or a two prop z-interval. The last one, if you are working with qualitative data and you have two samples and you know that they are dependent on each other, this one is, I guess, kind of not to worry about. It wasn't covered in class, so you're not going to have to worry about addressing that one. So let's go ahead and talk about a couple of examples, and then from there, I highly encourage you to dive right into the homework on this one, because I think it'll go pretty quickly. So our first example reads, is there strong evidence of global warming? Let's consider a small-scale example comparing how temperatures have changed in the U.S. from 1968 to 2008. The daily high temperature reading on January 1st was collected in 1968 and 2008 for 51 randomly selected locations in the continental U.S. Then the difference between the two readings, temperature in 2008 minus temperature in 1968, was calculated for each of the 51 different locations. The average of these 51 values was 1.1 degrees with a standard deviation of 4.9 degrees. We are interested in determining whether these data provide strong evidence of temperature warming in the continental U.S. So in order to answer this problem, let's go back to our flowchart, everyone. So I want to ask myself the following questions. So do I have quantitative or qualitative data? In this situation, I was taking a temperature, so we are working with quantitative data. And now, I also note here, do I have one or two samples? Well, the fact is that they're telling us that they took temperatures in 1968 and in 2008. So we have two different groups, 1968 and 2008. So that seems like I've got two samples here. The next question, are these samples independent or are they dependent on each other? And to answer that one, I would argue that they are dependent. We went to the same 51 randomly selected locations within the U.S. in order to get these temperatures. So we were being consistent to see if there was some sort of change over those years. So that tells me that I'm going to do a paired t-test in this situation. Not an interval, because, again, we are interested in determining whether these data provide strong evidence of temperature warming in the continental U.S. So we are just asking, has it changed? And maybe in this instance, is it getting warmer? Okay, so let's go ahead and try a second example. Our second example reads, we are interested in estimating the proportion of students at a university who smoke. Out of a random sample of 200 students from this university, 40 students smoke. Calculate a 95% confidence interval for the proportion of students at this university who smoke and interpret this interval in context. So again, we're not actually being asked to conduct the full confidence interval in this situation. We are just trying to decide which one we are going to employ. So let's go back to our flowchart. And in this case, I know that we're working with qualitative data because we are just asking students, do you smoke or do you not smoke? So we're getting a yes/no response. From here, I'm only going to one sample of students. Like, we're not breaking them up into several different groups. So like field of study or number of years at the university or anything like that. We're just going to university students, done. So because of that, we are going to do a one prop z interval. Again, we're not doing a test here because we were asked to conduct specifically a 95% confidence interval. So this is essentially what Section 9.4 is asking you to do. It's not asking you to actually carry out the hypothesis test or the confidence interval. They're just asking you to identify which pathway you're going to take in order to answer the question. I hope that this was useful. If you have any questions, you know where to find me. Have a good rest of your day. Bye.